Be sure to check out mythvisionpodcast.com. Help MythVision grow, guys. Become a Patreon member. You guys will get early access to all my videos when I'm done editing them. Also, it's a small community where you guys can message me your questions and talk to me in private. You guys can also donate through PayPal and Cash App. Join the social media links down in the description. We have Twitter, Facebook, all sorts of social media. Help the community of MythVision grow. Hit the subscribe button, hit that bell so you guys are notified every time I do a live video and you don't miss any of my content. Dr. Price, Cat Woods asks a question. This is on YouTube. Is this timed out already? If not, here are my questions. Number 1. The author of Matthew was apparently a Torah-observant Christian. He couldn't read Hebrew, but he was obsessed with the Hebrew Bible. So how does Dr. Price think the people like this came to hate the Jews enough to invent the whole thing of the Jewish crowd accepting blame for themselves and their descendants? I know they justified it with the idea that the Jews rejected the Messiah, but really, it doesn't make any sense. I would expect Torah-observant Christians to be nicer to Jews, not exceptionally hateful toward them. Besides the obvious nonsense of blaming the people being oppressed for the actions of the oppressors, the Jews would have screwed up God's entire plan for salvation if they hadn't rejected the Messiah, so how could the Christians condemn them for it?
Yeah, it's a bunch of good questions. You're going to have to remind me of whichever ones I forget. But Matthew, I believe, could read Hebrew because, as I said with another question, he quotes the Old Testament a lot, and depending on what point he wants to make, he seems to be able to go back and forth between the Hebrew, the Greek Septuagint, and the Syriac translation of the Hebrew Bible. And so he seems to have been a Jewish scribe. He's really talking about himself in chapter 13. Every scribe trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings forth out of his treasury goods old and new. So we know what the text meant and what it still means to Jews, but there are new insights that one understands only in retrospect once you become a Christian. And he is a stickler for the Torah in its niceties. Like, look at what he says in chapter 23 as Jesus talk about what is a legitimate and an illegitimate basis to swear oaths on and things like this. How did he come to seemingly be anti-Semitic? Well, I don't think he did exactly. This was in the period, like the very late 1st century or early 2nd century, when so-called formative Judaism was being consolidated at the Yavna Sanhedrin with Akiba and all these guys. And they had representatives from various surviving Jewish parties there, but excluded Jewish Christians, apparently because of the worship of Jesus. And they said, we can't have that. And Matthew's group would be the excluded one, and he doesn't want to overturn the authority of the Torah. Not only does he have Jesus, after his resurrection, telling people to tell the nations to keep even the least commandments, but he actually has Jesus say in the beginning of chapter 23, the Pharisees have the seat of Moses, so whatever they say, you got to do. That's pretty surprising. But do it better than them, because they're hypocrites. They don't do what they say we ought to do. And they're right about the first, but not the second. They're right, but we should actually live up to it. Because unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, there's no way you're entering the kingdom of heaven. So that kind of puts his view in a nutshell. In his version of the parable of the wicked tenants who try to usurp the ownership of the vineyard by killing the servants and then the son of the landowner, they figure, well, according to the law, this old guy's going to die and we've killed his heir, so it would fall to us as in possession of it. And Jesus says they're not going to get away with it. The landowner will send people to exterminate them, and then he'll put the vineyard in the hands of others. Well, that either means the temple is going to have a new hierarchy, or the kingdom of God, Christian, will be given to the Gentiles, because he does anticipate a Gentile mission. Or it might mean that we will have forfeited our right to independence, and God will allow the Romans to rule it. Not what any of us want, but that may be what you're asking for. It's the temple authorities, right, who are in charge of the vineyard of Israel, and they're screwing it up. So you'll answer for it, and the rest of us with you. So he's in competition. Like he says, don't call anybody Abba or Rabbi, which were the two common titles given to Jewish sages. This is a classic sectarian thing, an egalitarian democratization. Like, we don't want any of your education. You're just sophists complicating things. And but this is competition with another Jewish group. He doesn't think he's starting a new religion, or that Jesus did. Far from it. So it's not exactly anti-Semitism. What about this statement, though, when Pilate says, look, this is on you, I want no part of this with Jesus, and he says, okay, we'll take it. Let his blood be on us and our children. Well, Matthew did think that the War of 70 and the destruction of the temple was because the people had not done righteously, especially by rejecting Jesus. So yeah, it's their fault. They shouldn't have done it. I don't think that qualifies as anti-Semitism. I see how somebody would think so, but you really have to draw a distinction, because again, he's talking about fellow Jews, and he's saying, you're going to get us in big trouble. I just can't see that as like Hitler or the Russians with the protocols of the elders of Zion. And the Gospel of John, maybe. That's a bit different. But with this, I don't see it that way. And in fact, I think there's a double entendre in what Matthew has the Jews say. For one thing, upon us and our children. Of course, that does not have to mean, I don't think it likely means, us and all generations of Jews are going to be cursed. I don't think that's the point. He says us and our children, because he's got to allow another generation before 70 when the temple will be destroyed. But the double entendre is these words reflect very closely what Moses says in Exodus when he's sealing the deal with the people on the covenant. He has the Book of the Covenant there, and he's got a pan of sacrificial blood, takes the hyssop brush and sprinkles the blood on the scroll and on representatives of the people. He says, behold the blood of the covenant. And it's literally on you and your children. I think that he's saying this at the same time establishes the new covenant in his blood. And it's just like in the Gospel of John, where Caiaphas, I think, says to the Sanhedrin, what are we going to do about this? He says, well, we got to make Jesus the sacrificial lamb if we don't stop him now. And he creates rioting and all that. The Romans will be down on us like flies on honey. It's better that one guy should die, innocently even, it implies, than for the whole people to be exterminated, which is liable to happen. John says, well, he was the high priest, so even though he was a jerk, he did have God's ear and could speak prophecies, and know it or not, he did.
Kind of like Saul was still anointed, even though he was doing all the crap that he was doing.
and Saul prophesies. And so he didn't know the full extent of what he was saying, because Jesus is going to die for the people and an atonement and so on. So I think the Matthew thing is a double entendre, and so that he's including fellow Jews in the redemption. So I don't think you can read this like in the Gospel of John, the Jews, the Jews. I mean, that's worrisome and hard to explain, but this isn't, to my mind.
Right. That's interesting. So all of this really is an in-house fighting type thing. And to act like he's anti-Semitic to his own self or to his own kind, which you notice in the question, there was the presumption that he wasn't Jewish because he didn't know how to read Hebrew, which meant it was probably a Greek writing Matthew. Instead of it being a possible Jewish scribe who knew Greek as well as knew Hebrew or these other Syriac versions in the Septuagint and whatnot. So yeah, if what you're saying is true, now what if it was a Gentile who wrote it that didn't know Hebrew? What if? I mean, we know that he did, or whoever. It's most likely a he. I mean, I doubt females back in the first century were scribes. So what would happen then if, let's say they didn't know Hebrew and it was actually a Gentile? Which I don't think it would be, because they know too much Jewish.
Yeah, I do too. Even the thing, I read one book where scholars said that he couldn't have been Jewish, because look at what he does with the donkeys in the triumphal entry. He says, well, Zechariah says he's coming to you mounted on a donkey, the foal of an ass, or even the foal of an ass. Matthew says, two animals, sort of rodeo style? And he didn't understand. No, I'm afraid he did. A great book on Hebrew poetry says the rabbis understood parallelism in Hebrew poetry. You're saying the same thing another way, a very effective technique. But when it came to, and they continued to use it in their own poetry and hymns, but there was a style of hyper-literal interpretation, because you wanted to squeeze as much information out of the text as you could, kind of like the Kabbalah people did in a different way. So Matthew said, in terms of what Jesus did, it must have been a donkey and her colt. Yeah, that was just the style, which seems absurd to us, but is well attested back there. So that shows he did know his Judaism. And it'd be amazing if he were a Gentile that knew all this stuff, or had bothered to acquaint himself with the Hebrew, the Syriac, and the Greek Old Testament, or would care about all these things that Jesus talks about. Well, you can swear by the altar, or not by the altar, but by the gold on the altar, because what does he care? And so I don't think it's like a contrary to fact condition. What if he was a Gentile? What if he was a Martian? Well, could be, I guess.